How many times have you heard or read the phrase rogue elements in regard to the people who pulled off the murder of John Kennedy? It's a genius turn of phrase in this context, I think. Rogue elements. Fitting. The word rogue is defined as follows by the online version of the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Adjective. Resembling or suggesting a rogue elephant, especially in being isolated, dangerous, or uncontrollable, corrupt, dishonest. Noun. Scoundrel, scamp, tramp, vagrant. And under verb, we find to go rogue, to begin to behave in an independent or uncontrolled way that is not authorized, normal, or expected. To go rogue, to begin to behave in an independent or uncontrolled way that is not authorized, normal, or expected. That's the one. Whoever did this, they absolutely went rogue. You cannot argue that. Something drove them to it. They went rogue to solve a problem. They went rogue because Kennedy didn't want to go to Vietnam? I don't believe so. Because Kennedy didn't want Israel to have nukes? No, not in my opinion. That's just conspiracy buff fluff. Because Lyndon Johnson told them to? Lyndon Johnson never masterminded much of anything in reality. Not a damn thing beyond, a few stolen elections in Podunk, Texas territory, much less Kennedy's murder. Now, that guy who took to the television airwaves to emphatically state that he'd neither seek nor accept his party's presidential nomination was no evil genius type mastermind. No, that's more fluff. No, the people that decided to be proactive here, the people who decided that setting up a paramilitary-style ambush in an American city in broad daylight for the specific purpose of blowing John Kennedy's head off was a good idea, took this extraordinary step to solve what they considered their own extraordinary problem. Much has been made in the last 61 years of many people, many groups, many factions that for many different reasons had an extraordinary problem of some manner with President Kennedy and his brother. Let's focus a bit on one faction in particular, a few individuals from a specific group of 18 individuals. Here's what I mean. In late March of 1963, Robert Kennedy's Justice Department put the clamp down on a carefully chosen list of the most active and most prolific anti-Castro paramilitary operatives running privately funded covert operations and unsanctioned raids into Cuba, confined them to their county of residence, and threatened them with imprisonment if they were caught continuing their efforts to launch raids from U.S. soil. Despite the public proclamations of support, despite the millions of clandestine dollars thrown at the problem since the late 50s, despite monumental and ultimately futile covert programs such as Operation Mongoose, since scrapped in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, despite the training and guns and ammo and support and cheerleading and no-show jobs and boats and military surplus gun turrets and envelopes of cash handed out to the wives and safe houses and front companies and promises made by agent handlers. The Kennedys had, in the end, at least in the eyes of a select few of the most well-trained and most dedicated of the anti-Castro paramilitary operators, not only abandoned the operators and their cause, but had proactively and maliciously moved to preempt their efforts to reclaim their homeland. Shut them down. If the individuals on this list happen to be unfortunate enough to get caught doing exactly what the U.S. intelligence apparatus had trained, funded, equipped, and encouraged them to do since the Bay of Pigs disaster, they'd have their boats, cars, gear, and weapons seized. Possible criminal prosecution. Shut them down. Now, in my opinion, the motive in Dallas was Cuba. Cuba was the reason. John Kennedy's perceived acquiescence to the Castro regime. And that is a perception widely held, or it was, and shared by these independent-minded paramilitary operators and highly trained Cuban exiles, and a select few of their sponsors and handlers, who had been forcibly benched. A perception that not only were they no longer being supported by the Kennedy administration, but that the president and his brother were actually actively thwarting their efforts. An extraordinary problem that may have resulted in the most extraordinary of measures. One can only imagine the level of anger, the level of resentment felt by these paramilitary operators and their trainers/leaders, after being shut down in the spring of 1963. Would it make them easy to recruit? I mean, for this particular kill team, the kill team recruited to assassinate John Kennedy, in terms of shooters, spotters, after-action damage assessment, drivers, does their particular skill set, coupled with their own unique resentment for the Kennedys, make them the most likely to go rogue? The first book I ever read regarding conspiracy in the assassination of John Kennedy was David Lifton's Best Evidence. Checked it out at my local public library during the summer of 1982. And that's a heck of a book for an 11-year-old to tackle. Therein lies the beginning of a 42-year exercise in amateur analysis, an embarkation into decades of amateur history detectivism. And since finishing Lifton's book, I've read more books on the JFK assassination than I could possibly recount, both pro and con conspiracy, and reread a lot of them. I can't even begin to conceive of how many hundreds of hours of my life I've spent studying this material, the documents, the eyewitness statements, poring over the declassified primary resource material on the case, the archives of the Mary Farrell Foundation, the Harold Weisberg archives at Hood College, the National Security Archive, blogs, monographs, research papers, and on and on and on and on. And in those 42 years after all that study, after all that analysis, after all of the context, the content, the claims, facts, speculation, good information, and bad information consumed, considered, and coalesced, I have ultimately come to be absolutely convinced of only three things. That's it. That's all. Just three things. To my own satisfaction, I am sure of but three things. One, Lee Harvey Oswald was not guilty of the murder of the 35th President of the United States. Two, a man named Felipe Vidal Santiago, although he fired no shots in Dealey Plaza that day, most certainly was guilty of participation in the paramilitary-style ambush that murdered John Kennedy in 1963. And three, so was Vidal's paramilitary cohort, a man named Roy Hargraves. But hey, that's just my opinion, albeit a learned one. And I do not share that opinion lightly in this field, the field of JFK assassination research. If you state an emphatic opinion or claim, you'd better be able to back it up. Preferably, to the moon and back. You'd better have something. Documents. A single document. An eyewitness statement. Corroboration for said eyewitness statement. Prove it, they will demand. Citations, please, they will insist. Can I prove it? Vidal and Hargraves. No, of course not. Not beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law kind of way. No more than Fletcher Prouty could prove, say, beyond a reasonable doubt, his claim regarding Ed Lansdale in Dealey Plaza. Our identification of Felipe Vidal Santiago in Dealey Plaza, like Prouty's Lansdale claim, is based in part on the extant photographic record of the Dallas action, both in progress and in the aftermath. I think we have Vidal on film. Not only that, but we have more than just, say, one solitary, far-off black and white snapshot of the back of some guy's head, as is the case with the antiquated Lansdale claim. I believe that we have multiple photographs, along with film footage of Felipe Vidal Santiago in Dealey Plaza, participating in the paramilitary operation implemented to kill John Kennedy. It is my opinion that the individual that we have come to collectively know as dark-complected man is, in fact, Felipe Vidal Santiago. Again, can I prove that to be Vidal in those photos on that film? Nope. Not even close. But that's him. I'm convinced. His presence in Dallas during November of 1963, guys, is not an allegation. We know unequivocally, undeniably, that Vidal was indeed in Dallas in November of 1963. That is documented by the FBI and the INS, no less. And Roy Hargraves, he straight up told author Noel Twyman that he and Vidal were there, participating in the operation as part of a four-man support team for the shooters. Privately and off the record, of course. But I digress. In late March of 1963, just days before somebody fired a bullet at the head of hard-right ex-U.S. Army General Edwin Walker in Dallas, a shooting, of course, which will be posthumously blamed on Lee Oswald, Felipe Vidal Santiago became one of the first recipients of what RFK's Justice Department called a special notice of prevention of departure, hereby confined to county, the shutdown. On April 1, 1963, the New York Times published an article detailing the DOJ's efforts to curtail these independent Cuban raids, and they issued notices of prevention of departure. The article, United States Curbs Miami Exiles to Prevent Raids on Cuba, read in part. Here we go. Quoting the article now. Washington, March 31, the government moved today to enforce its policy of preventing Cuban refugees from using U.S. territory to organize and launch raids into Cuba. The Justice Department placed restrictions on 18 Cubans in the Miami area. The department did not disclose the names of those restricted. Dispatches confirmed that some members of two exile groups already involved in raids had been given the restriction orders. They were the Alpha 66 and the Second Front of Escambray groups. Violation of the orders issued through the Immigration and Naturalization Service could be enforced by arrest or deportation. In its announcement yesterday, that it planned to take every necessary step to prevent raids, the government expressed sympathy for the anti-Castro cause. The administration's dilemma was reflected in the careful wording of yesterday's statement. Washington fears that, should the exiles continue, the Soviet Union or Cuba would be provoked to retaliate, either against American shipping or against the American reconnaissance planes that now fly over Cuba daily with impunity. We intend to take every step necessary to ensure that such raids are not launched, manned, or equipped on U.S. territory, one official said. The sympathy of the U.S. government and the American people are with those Cubans who wish to see their country free from communist control, but this understanding does not mean that we are prepared to see our own laws violated with impunity or to tolerate such activities which might provoke armed reprisal. Misspoke there for a second. Now, the U.S. State Department, the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, and United States Customs and CIA would all be working together, working this problem, working together to shut down the autonomous anti-Castro operatives. The two anti-Castro groups, organizations mentioned in this New York Times article we just quoted, Alpha 66 and the Second National Front of Escambray, were but two of the autonomous exile organizations that had by that time absolutely become gigantic pains in President Kennedy's ass. These guys were getting more and more brazen, less and less concerned with potential political fallout resulting from their ops. Examples. During the month prior to the shutdown alone, Alpha 66 and the Second National Front collaborated on pretty high-profile attacks aimed at two Russian ships, opening fire on the Soviet merchant ship Lvov in Cuban waters on the night of March 17th through the 18th, and attacking a Soviet ship called the Baku in the Cuban port of Caribbean on March 27th. The USSR filed immediate official diplomatic protests in both instances, pointing out that the U.S. actually had strict laws against exactly what the Cuban exiles were continually getting away with on the regular. And if these guys weren't already a little cocky, they got cocky. On March 19th, they rubbed the first attack right in the Kennedy administration's grill. A66 and the Second National Front got together and held a big joint press conference in Washington, D.C., no less, to announce and take credit for the attack on the Lvov. They also, surprise, vowed to do it again, which they did just 8 days later. To go rogue, to begin to behave in an independent or uncontrolled way that is not authorized, normal, or expected. During an executive committee meeting on March 29, Lyndon Johnson suggested using the United States military to go after the autonomous Cuban raiders, and he opined that we would be criticized for letting them go on the one hand or stopping them on the other, and that the U.S. military should take all actions necessary, quote, to halt the unauthorized raids. George Bundy was also in favor of the shutdown. CIA Director John McCone, he said leave them alone. JFK and RFK decided to shut them down. Now, not all raids, keep that in mind, don't misunderstand. The Kennedys loved them some covert ops, just not others' covert ops so much. And there were at that time still plenty of covert paramilitary shenanigans planned for Fidel and his little ragtag band of revolutionaries moving into Kennedy's second term. But that's another several dozen stories. See, thing is, when I look at the list of independent paramilitary operators shut down by the Kennedys, I see a list of individuals who certainly possessed the means to carry out the operation in Dealey Plaza. They had the specialized training, the equipment, and real-world covert operations experience. And they certainly had plenty of motive. But of the people who received these notices of prevention of departure, did any of them, other than apparently Vidal, actually avail themselves of the opportunity to solve their particular extraordinary problem? The problem of the Kennedy administration and Cuba. Among the individuals shut down by the Kennedys in April of 1963 were more than one who would later be either linked to, suspected of participating in, alleged to have confessed to participating in, or alleged to have revealed having personal knowledge of the JFK hit. Case in point, another operative on that list, Antonio Suesta del Valle. Tony Suesta. Tony Suesta, whose CIA cryptonym was AM Denim 14, was a storied and a legendary guy. He was one of the founders of Alpha 66 and its splinter group, Commandos L, and one of the main planners / participants in the aforementioned attack on the Baku that embarrassed the hell out of the Kennedy administration. He was active, guys. He was entrenched, trained, dedicated, and active. The real deal. Connected to many names that we as an historical research community have had reason to study over the decades. On May 29th of 1966, a Tony Suesta-led Cuban raid was intercepted by Castro's gunboats off the coast of Miramar, Cuba. And as you might expect, a firefight did thus ensue. End result, Suesta, blind from an explosion and now missing a hand, captured alive. Most of his team dead. The purpose of this covert op had been to infiltrate two guys, one Armando Romero and one Herminio Diaz Garcia, into Cuba with the mission to assassinate Fidel Castro at the El Comodoro Hotel, right there in Miramar, using rocket fire. Well, no sooner than these guys managed to get the rockets planted and quasi-aimed at the hotel, no less than 11 of Castro's gunboats were right on top of them, and it was over pretty quickly. 4 of Suesta's 6-man team killed. Suesta and one other man wounded and captured. Both of the team's would-be assassins, Diaz Garcia and Romero, were killed in the firefight. Suesta would spend the next 12 years in prison in Cuba. He was eventually released as part of a prisoner swap negotiated by the Carter administration in 1978. Now, you ever hear of a thing called the Nassau Conference? 1995. Some of the most well-known and learned minds who were at the time studying this thing, some very well-known authors and assassination researchers, took a trip to the Caribbean for the purpose of having a sit-down with the by-then retired Cuban Major General Fabian Escalante, formerly of Cuba's Ministry of the Interior. This guy was a big deal. And for those of you listening rather than reading the transcript, the words big deal are in italics. He was, for decades, Castro's numero uno counterintelligence chief. Think Angleton's job with military rank, but without the paranoia and, alcoholism. Now, this traveling band of history detectives were looking to have a look at some of the Castro regime's JFK assassination files whilst down in the tropics, and to hear from Escalante himself what the Cubans knew and suspected about Dallas. And according to Escalante, Suesta confessed to Escalante knowledge of the inner workings of the plot that murdered Kennedy and named two of the shooters in Dealey Plaza. Now, it's very important to note here that Suesta did not say, I was involved. He said, I knew some guys who were. Now, I know some will claim that Suesta confessed involvement, and that would be incorrect. The following is from General Fabian Escalante's own book, JFK, The Cuba Files, The Untold Story of the Plot to Kill Kennedy, which was published in 2006 as part of Escalante's series of books, The Secret War. I'm going to read to you what he wrote about Tony Suesta. Shortly before his release, General Escalante wrote, years later, Antonio Suesta, probably prompted by gratitude for the medical and humane attention he had received in detention as he had been blinded and maimed in an explosion aboard the vessel he was captaining at the time of his arrest, affirmed that Herminio Diaz Garcia and Eladio del Valle were part of the Kennedy assassination operation. According to Suesta, they arrived in Dallas on November 20th of 1963 and subsequently handled large sums of money. He affirmed that he learned this from Herminio Diaz, who had referred to it on one occasion. This revelation took us by surprise. Sadly, despite our insistence, we were unable to discover anything more about the event. He probably knew a lot more than he said, but feared for his family or for his fate if he returned to Miami. In any event, he offered us nothing more. It was important because without a doubt, Antonio Suesta was deeply involved in the Cuban exile movement, particularly in New Orleans, up until 1966. In addition to its open CIA affiliation, his group was one of those selected for the notorious autonomous operations conducted in 1963. He was one of the key links to the New Orleans Mafia and, as such, participated in smuggling arms out of Dallas in that period. Now, as you and I are painfully aware, the internet is awash with bad information, disinformation, and non-information. And if you study the JFK assassination for a long enough period of time, you kind of feel like a magnet for that stuff. It's everywhere. And it matters not, dear reader and or listener, just which subtopic related to the JFK assassination, be it an individual or event, that you choose to focus your attention upon. You will be confronted with inaccurate Bravo Sierra related to said individual and or event. So beware. Example. Recently, I read in 2 different places on the internet and in one actual book on the same day, no less, that Tony Suesta had actually confessed to General Escalante that he, Suesta, had been involved in the JFK hit. He did no such thing. Had this actually happened, I'm almost positive that General Escalante would have included it, a tidbit of that magnitude somewhere in the previously quoted passage from his previously cited book. Or maybe he would have said so in Nassau. Neither occurred. Therefore, we must conclude that Suesta never made this admission to Escalante. But hey, the one JFK assassination book in which I read that particular piece of disinformation was actually ghostwritten for an ex-professional wrestler with a soft spot for feather boas. Know what I'm saying? Oswald in the CIA? It ain't. Right below Tony Suesta on our list of Cuban exile detainees is the name Pedro Diaz-Lanz, whose CIA cryptonym was QD Bias, B-I-A-S. In 1963, by then longtime friend of future Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis, and covert operations cohort of the aforementioned Felipe Vidal Santiago. Indeed, we have a big old fistful of CIA documents showing that Diaz-Lanz, his brother Marcos, and Vidal were working hot and heavy together in the run-up to Dallas. These documents were generated by Frank Sturgis, creeping these guys and then ratting out their plans to his CIA case officer, Bernard Barker, another future Watergate burglar. Barker would then dutifully alert headquarters, who would then dutifully alert the FBI and a Miami customs agent named Cesar Diaz of the planned operation, part of the shutdown, as ordered by the Kennedys. Pedro Diaz-Lanz was a bona fide hero of the revolution. By all accounts, an ace fighter pilot with a well-deserved reputation as a pro. Joined up with Castro in 1957 and spent the revolution flying guns into Cuba to fuel said revolution. And on January 1 of 1959, Diaz-Lanz was named Chief of the Revolutionary Air Force by Premier Castro, his own bad self. Diaz-Lanz's time occupying this prestigious post lasted just shy of 6 months. See, Diaz-Lanz realized pretty damn quickly that Castro was leaning unabashedly communist and made his displeasure regarding this loudly known. He was thus relieved of his post as Air Force Chief and defected post haste. He arrived in Miami with his family in a small boat on July 1st of 1959, and he wasted no time, guys, becoming active, putting his aviation-type skills and reputation as a military leader to work in the secret Cuban War right off the bat. Regarding the JFK conspiracy, Pedro Diaz-Lanz and his brother Marcos, CIA cryptonym QD Char, C-H-A-R, fall squarely into the outright accused of participating in category. Both were cryptonym-carrying members of a murky, very murky, shadowy covert op network called the Amots. Pedro had the cryptonym Amot 5, Marcos Amot 6. This was a super-secret elite group of Cuban exiles personally recruited and trained by CIA's David Morales to become Cuba's intelligence service after the fall of Castro. The Amots are thought by some who study this stuff to have been the perfect, quote, covert mechanism, unquote, through which an operation like the Kennedy assassination, would have or could have been run. The Diaz-Lanz brothers have been considered suspect in regard to the attack in Dallas since the 1960s and certainly have been accused of involvement by more than one. Marita Lorenz is just an example. Marita Lorenz is pretty legendary herself. It's a hell of a story. She met Castro when she was still a teenager, when the cruise ship, captained by her father, docked in Havana and hosted Fidel for dinner. Castro was extremely taken by her, and she fast became Castro's mistress. After that tryst ended very horribly for her, she found herself skillfully manipulated and recruited into the CIA's secret Cuban War by Frank Sturgis. Yep, same guy. Eventually, Lorenz actually returned to Cuba on a mission to assassinate Castro with poison all by herself at Sturgis's behest. And it almost worked, but it didn't. Lorenz returned to South Florida and the secret Cuban War and the exiles and the training camps and the gun running and the safe houses and gunboats and Frank Sturgis and his buddies. And as noted earlier, Pedro Diaz-Lanz was certainly Sturgis's buddy. They had worked together in Cuba, fought together for Cuba, grown to distrust Fidel together, and had run numerous missions in and out of Cuba together since Diaz-Lanz's defection. And it's in this context the continuing activity of paramilitary operators specifically forbidden by the Kennedys from actually operating, that Lorenz's accusations regarding Sturgis, the Diaz-Lanz brothers, and the Kennedy assassination emerge. It was a caravan, Lorenz said. A caravan of cars, paramilitary anti-Castro personnel, and sniper rifles from South Florida to Dallas in November of 1963. Now, there are several different versions of Lorenz's recollections of the weekend of the JFK hit out there, but the version I'll share with you here is written in her own hand in July of 1977. Marita sat down and composed a 17-page letter and gave it to a longtime U.S. Customs agent out of Miami named Stephen Sukas to deliver to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. On November 7th of that year, Sukas hand-delivered the letter to members of the committee. The version/copy that I'll be reading from is an HSCA document. Matter of fact, that I found in the Baylor University John Armstrong Archive there at the Pogue Library website, complete with a receipt for the green notebook in which her letter was contained, made out to Sukas and signed by a committee staffer. It's pretty cool. In her letter, Lorenz goes into great detail about her initial meeting with Castro, their courtship, the murky circumstances surrounding her removal from Cuba, her recruitment into Frank Sturgis's International Anti-Communism Brigade, and her failed mission to kill Castro. She also tells of being operational with Diaz-Lanz and, along with Diaz-Lanz, meeting a person she is sure was Lee Harvey Oswald. He was introduced to her, Lorenz said, as Ozzy in 1963 in Florida, allegedly. Beginning at the bottom of page 4 of her letter, Lorenz details this pre-assassination meeting attended by herself, Pedro Diaz-Lanz, and Lee Oswald in Miami. According to Lorenz, the meeting was arranged by Sturgis and occurred at the home of a prominent and uber-violent Cuban exile named Orlando Bosch. Lorenz writes, a month or so before November 22, 1963, I joined Frank Fiorini, who is Sturgis, Ozzy, who is Lee, and the other Cubans in our group and drove in 2 cars to the home of Orlando Bosch. This certain highly secret meeting in Bosch's home was to discuss certain streets in Dallas, Texas. There was talk of a highly powerful rifle and discussions of feet, buildings, timing, contacts, silence, etc. The word Kennedy spoken by Frank and Bosch made me say, well, what about him? All eyes were on me, studying me, when Ozzy started a dispute with Frank and Bosch about my presence. I then told Frank, who needs this slimy bastard? In Bosch's house that evening, I called Ozzy a chivato, which to Frank. And when Ozzy challenged me, I asked him, how did you know the meaning of that word? It was Fidel's favorite word for informant. Traitor. Ozzy said he heard it in Cuba, Florida, and Cuba. On page 13 of her handwritten letter, Lorenz begins detailing her experience with Pedro Diaz-Lanz, Sturgis, Oswald, and others on the weekend of the Kennedy hit. She writes, sometime in November of 1963, I told Frank, sure, I'll go with him and the others in 2 cars to Dallas. We left after midnight in 2 beat-up-looking cars, about 8 or 9 of us, with Frank's baby, a high-powered rifle scope and silencer attached in the trunk of our car. Before we left, we were briefed by Frank, Bosch, and Pedro Diaz-Lanz. No phone calls, no speaking Spanish in Texas, no leaving for a restaurant, complete obedience, she writes. According to Lorenz, after arriving in Dallas with Diaz-Lanz, Sturgis, and the others, 3 visitors were received by this traveling band of assassins in their roadside motel room. Lee Oswald, who delivered a newspaper, Jack Ruby, who spoke to Sturgis privately outside, and a balding guy called Eduardo, whom Lorenz says she later ID'd as infamous CIA troublemaker E. Howard Hunt. Now, regarding the man Lorenz later ID'd as Jack Ruby, she wrote to the HSCA, quote, "I later told Frank, where'd you get the mafia punk? What the hell are we really doing here?" Frank studied me and escorted me outside. He replied by saying, "You make the men nervous. I made a mistake. This is too big. I want you to go back to Miami." I agreed and told him I didn't like his selection of men, Ozzie and Ruby, who were new, who were not team members. I had a feeling, a suspicion, that Frank's group were in Texas to kill somebody because of the secrecy of the whole thing. Never in a million years did I put two and two together, or was there even hinted as to what they were up to. All I know is that everything I've written and I am writing is the truth, so help me God. You know, often I am starkly reminded of just how small this covert universe of 1963 that we study really was. This circle, this mix of mafia, intelligence officers, intelligence assets, intelligence and paramilitary operatives, gun runners, con men, mercenaries, that we, the research community, have come to believe gave birth to this conspiracy. Like Dirk Gently said, you remember that book? Everyone is connected. They really are with this collective of operators. 1 to 3 degrees of separation in a lot of cases. It really is a small circle that we study, and Pedro Diaz-Lanz was absolutely a member of this circle, as were his brother and Sturgis. But whatever they may have done, whatever he may have known, however he may have participated in the attack in Dallas, he took it all to the grave. Pedro Diaz-Lanz died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 2008 at the age of 81, after it was reported years of poverty, ill health, and depression. The last paramilitary exile recipient of the RFK Justice Department's notices of prevention of departure that we'll discuss here is, as I said, one of 2 individuals that I am convinced took part in the Dealey Plaza operation, Felipe Vidal Santiago. Actually, you know what? Hang on. Full stop. Let's back up. I've got to amend everything I said at the top of this thing, okay? Total change up. I think I'm actually absolutely convinced of 4 things, not 3. Let me explain. While I've been putting this together for my dear friend Alan Dale and the AARC, I've also been simultaneously writing a presentation for the November in Dallas 2024 JFK Assassination Research Conference presented by JFK Lancer Publications. That presentation will, or did, depending on when you, the listener and or reader, are experiencing this presentation, focus on a different group of guys later connected to and or suspected of involvement in the attack in Dallas, who were at some point locked up in a Cuban prison called Triscornia by Fidel Castro. Okay? Now, one of those guys was John Martino. And I got to say, upon further review, I think Martino is right there with Vidal and Hargraves for me. I mean, I'm pretty well damn convinced. Yep. See, like Vidal and Hargraves, Vidal and Martino were tight. And like Hargraves, Martino confessed. Martino was a mob guy. He was pinched in Miami in 1935 for a numbers racket, loan sharking in 1947. By 59, he was working at the Deauville Casino, which was owned by Santo Trafficante, no less, in Havana, Cuba. That year, Martino was arrested and imprisoned by the Castro regime after a pro-Castro hotel employee dutifully reported Martino to the authorities for making anti-Castro statements out loud. Martino would spend 3 years and 3 months languishing in various hellish Cuban prisons for not being able to keep his Yankee opinion to himself. He finally made it home to Miami in October of 1962. He released a book about his experiences in Cuba, and then he dove ass over elbows head first into the paramilitary anti-Castro cause. The list of people that he managed to meet and become operational with and active with between his October of 1962 return and November 22nd of 1963 reads like a who's who of shady dudes later connected to the assassination by researchers over the ensuing decades. People like William Rip Robertson, who many people think can be spotted in Dealey Plaza in photographs, the one of only 2 Anglos to actually go ashore and fight with Brigade 2506 at the Bay of Pigs. Roy Hargraves. Martino knew him. He knew Jerry Hemming, General Edwin Walker, future Watergate burglars, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. Of course, Santo Trafficante. He knew CIA's David Morales, Lauren Hall, and of course, Vidal. According to Martino's wife and son, his behavior on November 22nd, 1963 was abnormal at best. First, he nervously insisted that his son stay home from school. Excuse me, I believe his son was a high schooler, and that was totally out of character. And his nervousness never abated that morning, only becoming more noticeable as the morning progressed. And later, while watching a television report on President Kennedy's campaign swing through Texas, Martino turned to his wife and said, quote, "They're going to kill him, Flo. They're going to kill him when he gets to Dallas." Allegedly. But hey, it's not me making the claim. His widow did. I just happen to believe her. Martino died in 1975, but apparently spilled the beans regarding his participation in the plot to at least 2 different individuals outside of his family before his death: his business partner Fred Clausen and journalist John Cummings. Martino revealed that the main movers on the ground in the plot were anti-Castro Cuban exiles. That Lee Oswald was, although not a shooter, he was involved in the plot, and that Oswald had been approached, recruited, and set up by anti-Castro Cubans representing themselves to Oswald as pro-Castro Cubans. Martino described his own role in the operation as kind of a facilitator, making trips to Dallas and New Orleans, delivering money, supplies, messages, and instructions. Oswald, Martino revealed, had been murdered by Ruby because Oswald screwed up the plan by somehow managing to be taken alive by the Dallas police. In the weeks following Kennedy's murder, something weird happened. A steady stream of misinformation regarding Oswald being a Castro agent began spilling forth from all kinds of different sources, but in essence, it was the same story and same inaccurate details. It was an orchestrated campaign. American hard right organizations, CIA-connected anti-Castro organizations, mostly. But also from John Martino at speeches and at book signings. Almost word for word. In February of 1964, The FBI decided to visit Mr. Martino at his home in Miami to find out just where in the hell he was getting this bad information. The interview took place on February 15th of 1964. Now, according to the reporting agents, Martino spent most of the interview deflecting their questions. He preferred to complain about and talk about how, as he saw it, the U.S. State Department had absolutely refused to assist him in any way in gaining his release from Castro's correctional system. But he did introduce the agents to his house guest that day. Reading now from the FBI document, quote, during the interview at Martino's residence, Martino introduced the interviewing agents to Cuban exile Felipe Vidal Santiago, who is the subject of Bu File 105-85523, Miami File 105-6466. Vidal has been active in anti-Castro activities and may be one of Martino's, quote, unidentified, unquote, sources on Cuban matters. Damn. You know, that's what I thought the first time I read this particular document, which I think might have been 2014. I think. Damn, I thought to myself, two of them. They had two of them cornered. Same room. It still kind of blows my mind to read it again, you know. But where do I begin with Vidal? Again, there's nothing I could possibly write and or recite here that will be definitive proof of his involvement. But it starts with the figure we as a collective have come to know as dark-complected man in Dealey Plaza, the Pete Townsend-nosed, thinly built, beret-clad Latino individual who was very obviously not only there, but working with the Umbrella Man. They were obviously there together in Dealey Plaza. Yeah, I know what you're going to say. No, Doug. No, Doug. That's Cuban exile Orlando Bosch. Or, no, Doug, that's Gator. Have you heard that one? Gator. No, Doug, that's Gator. My question is always, and Gator's name is, you never get an answer to that. Just that Gator had only 3 fingers on one hand, and it's got to be him because an alleged ex-CIA pilot, that one guy, said so. I never really put any credence into what that one guy says. The story changed way too much, way too often over the years. A lot of diversionary rambling and Prouty-esque imagined scenarios. I dismissed that one guy long time ago. But back to Vidal. Vidal, whose CIA cryptonym was AM-Quip-1, AM-Quip, Q-U-I-P-1, can be seen as the naval equivalent, kind of Pedro Diaz-Lanz. Diaz-Lanz was a pilot and briefly commanded what constituted Castro's Air Force. Vidal served in the Cuban Navy from 44 to 56 and had obtained the rank of lieutenant at the time of his discharge. In 1958, like Diaz-Lanz, he threw in with Fidel. Fidel made Vidal the commander of the Cuban Maritime Patrol on January 1st of 1959. But Vidal's discontent, again, just like Pedro Diaz-Lanz, with Fidel's communist ways, they started bubbling to the surface. Castro removed Vidal from his command, shipped him off to Venezuela, appointing him the Cuban naval attaché to the Venezuelan government in October of 1959. It was this post in Caracas from which Vidal defected 5 months later. He arrived in Miami on August 9th of 1960 by way of Bogota, Colombia. By April of the next year, Vidal was running commando missions into Cuba, hit and run attacks, exfiltration missions. You remember the Who Killed JFK podcast? It ran last year around the anniversary. Rob Reiner, Soledad O'Brien. a lot of hype with that one. At the end, Mr. Reiner names, according to him and author Dick Russell, the shooters, the guys who they say actually fired weapons at Kennedy in Dealey Plaza, the guys who dropped the hammers. Now, one name they dropped puzzled more than a couple who've studied this stuff in detail, and the name was Jack Cannon, right? Even I was like, wait, what? You know? Well, it turns out, although that might be an obscure name to researchers, it may not be an unimportant name. Turns out, not only was there a paramilitary operator named Jack Cannon who was running with, guess who? Vidal, prior to the JFK hit, but according to the FBI, these guys made 43 paramilitary runs into Cuba together before August of 1962, running guns, documents, and money into Cuba and exfiltrating people from Cuba on the way back out. On August 8th of 1962, an informant told the FBI that on their 44th mission together, Vidal and Cannon had barely made it out alive on a rubber dinghy after their boat sank off the northern coast of Cuba, carrying $80,000 worth of weapons meant for anti-Castro rebels in country. Now, missing documents. Got your attention now, don't I? Doesn't that always make us suspicious? It does me. Back in the Pedro Diaz-Lanz segment, I mentioned documents that showed Vidal and Diaz-Lanz planning and running ops into Cuba together, and that Frank Sturgis was basically ratting them out to the CIA. This was specifically because Diaz-Lanz and Vidal had been recipients of the notices of prevention of departure handed down by Robert Kennedy's DOJ. The CIA would alert the FBI and INS, and then the attempt would be made to stop the operation. We have these reports monthly for the majority of 1963. They're hitting every month. Sturgis is going to Barker, right? The August entry is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is simply the content, the story it tells. Sturgis is nosing around Diaz-Lanz and Vidal, offering to help, offering to provide more air support, more people, more equipment. It's more than obvious that Vidal does not trust Frank Sturgis. Sturgis is trying very much to ingratiate himself with Vidal and extract from Vidal the date for which the next mission is planned. Vidal only tells Sturgis that A, Sturgis simply could not participate, and that is a direct quote, and B, that it was too late anyway, as Sturgis wouldn't be able to find an adequate crew in time for Vidal to vet them. Each time, every month, Vidal turns him down, and each time Sturgis runs to his case officer, future and fellow Watergate burglar Bernard Barker, to drop a dime on him. To help the CIA help the Kennedys to shut down the unauthorized nuisance raids into Cuba by rogue operators as per the DOJ's April of 63 decree. Now, the other interesting thing about this August report, it's the last one. Last report for 5 full months. The next report after the August one that will be visible to you and I in the year 2024 dropped in January of 1964. So that means September, October, November, and December of 1963 are, according to that thing, that page that pops up in the document's place instead of the actual document, under restricted access, it says. Yep, 4 consecutive CIA contact reports that may or may not reveal movements of 3 individuals later implicated in the JFK hit, beginning 2 months prior to the murder and continuing for 1 month after the murder, are classified top secret on the grounds of national security to this day because they, quote, contain security classified information. In 2024, 61 years later, we are not allowed to know what Diaz-Lanz and Vidal were doing / planning from September to December of 1963 from the perspective of the CIA. That, according to the United States government, is dangerous knowledge to possess. Think about that. But we don't need CIA's help in putting Vidal in Dallas in November of 1963. Thanks to the FBI, thanks to Robert Kennedy's DOJ and their April of 63 shutdown, and thanks to Vidal's right-hand Anglo, Roy Hargraves. Now, as we've seen, there seems to have been a kind of dimming of the lights regarding Vidal in late 1963. Now, when the lights are pulled back up by the FBI in January of 1964, we find Vidal hospitalized. Somebody, a little more than a month after Dallas, tried to assassinate Felipe Vidal Santiago with a bomb. A bomb. A bomb planted and detonated on his attack boat. Almost like somebody was, tying up loose ends. Being able to document Vidal's violation of his prevention of departure and travel to Dallas, Texas in November of 1963 comes from an FBI report from the Special Agent in Charge Miami office to Director J. Edgar Hoover, dated January 20th of 1964. Subject line is United Front for National Liberation, or FULN, which was Vidal's, organization. The FBI, it seemed, has been tracking Vidal closely since early January. On the 6th, they checked in with U.S. Customs for updated info on Vidal. Customs said they had no current info on his whereabouts, but on January 8th, they hit up Immigration and Naturalization. An INS agent named Tyrus Minix, at that point, told them about the attempted hit on Vidal with the bomb, and that Vidal was currently laid up in the hospital suffering from facial burns from the blast. Then, third paragraph, guys, pay attention. Top of page 2. Quote, the FBI agent writes, it is noted Vidal Santiago was served a notice of prevention of departure in March of 1963. This notice prevents him from leaving the land limits of Dade County, Florida. However, in April of 1963, Vidal was found in the Florida Keys, where U.S. Customs seized his boat and a load of arms. In November of 1963, Vidal visited Dallas, Texas, without permission of INS. And on January 5th of 1964 was on a boat 25 miles from Miami. In November of 1963, Vidal visited Dallas, Texas, without permission of INS. Right there, guys. We know he was in Dallas. And then there's Vidal's right-hand man, Roy Hargraves, and what he told author Noel Twyman. Roy Hargraves was one of the very first and most active American mercenaries to throw in with the paramilitary Cuban exiles. According to author Mr. Larry Hancock, one of just a few Americans to independently organize and lead missions into Cuba, even managing on one mission to steal a Cuban military boat and sail it to the Bahamas. He was an on-again, off-again member of Hemming's Inner Pen, a known builder of badass bombs. You know the story we've heard for years about the guy with dirty fingernails, flashing Secret Service credentials behind the grassy knoll stockade fence right after the assassination. Early in 1964, before the Warren Commission had even finished hiring their support staff, a man named William Aarc contacted the FBI about his neighbor, Roy Hargraves. Aarc was getting an uneasy feeling about his neighbor. He knew about his neighbor's paramilitary thing. He knew his neighbor had guns, a lot of guns. He knew he had military gear. He knew he traveled a lot, had seen and met some of the rough, tough-looking paramilitary and Cuban exile types that hung around his neighbor, Roy Hargraves' place. But Aarc, he felt compelled to reach out to the FBI upon learning two things about his neighbor, Mr. Hargraves. One, Aarc learned that his neighbor had been in Dallas in late November of 1963. Late November of 1963. And two, Aarc had seen his neighbor Roy with what appeared to be the ID/credentials of a United States Secret Service agent in December of 1963. The interviews were conducted for Mr. Twyman's excellent book on the Kennedy assassination, the book Bloody Treason, in 2001. 39 pages worth of excerpts of the transcripts were later published as an appendix by Larry Hancock in the first edition of his amazing book, Someone Would Have Talked, in 2006. Now, if I understand correctly, Roy Hargraves and his legal representation objected greatly to this. Therefore, Mr. Hancock was forced to 86 the whole thing from subsequent printings. Luckily, it's still out there, being distributed to and for researchers in PDF form. Now, I stand with Mr. Larry on these interview transcripts. Their importance, I consider them hugely important. You have to know who Hargraves was, know who he ran with, who he associated with, his history, his habits. And when you get well-versed in all that, and you're well-versed in the Cuban exile connections / aspects of the Kennedy assassination, well, the few nuggets that Hargraves does drop on Twyman are downright chilling to read. At one point, Hargraves is giving them the nuts and bolts about how an operation like that would go down. He tells Twyman and company that some of the hit team would be brought in blind, under cover of darkness, to like a cheap motel or a safe house. No idea what city they were in. Orders not to listen to any radio, no television, no newspapers. They only knew that they were active, that there was an operation, and that they had a role to play. That some might not necessarily even know who the target is until, and this is a quote, until the limo rounded the corner. And then at this point, seemingly out of the blue, he's asked if he had known that Kennedy would also be in Dallas. And now I'm reading right from the transcript. Question. I get a little confused here. When you had gone to Dallas, did you know that Kennedy was in Dallas at that time when you were going in there? Answer. The last we heard, he was going to Chicago. That's the last I heard anyway. And Philippe, never said anything about any changes. So far as I knew, Philippe was under the impression that Kennedy was going to be in Chicago. The last we heard, he was going to Chicago. Philippe never said anything about any changes. Are you familiar with the story of Abraham Bolden, ex-U.S. Secret Service agent, and what is known within the research community as the Chicago plot to kill Kennedy? Early November in Chicago. Obviously. President Kennedy was coming to town to attend a football game, according to former U.S. Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden. The FBI and the Secret Service office in Chicago received an anonymous tip that 4 Cuban exiles would attempt to kill Kennedy in Chicago along the route to the game with high-powered rifles. And according to some things you read, 2 of these guys were actually picked up by police and interrogated by the Secret Service on November 1st, only to be kicked loose. No charges filed. Kennedy's trip to Chicago was canceled. Abrupt. Last minute. As far as I know, no documentation from either the FBI, the Secret Service, or Chicago PD regarding those exiles has ever surfaced. But I do believe it absolutely possible that Kennedy was being tracked, that he was being stalked by more than one crew run by the same handler or handlers, that more than one location was in play, and that Chicago may have been one. And I believe that Vidal's crew were one of the crews tracking him. Philippe never said anything about any changes. Philippe was under the impression that Kennedy would be in Chicago. Hargraves would, guys, ultimately confess to Twyman in a private moment that he and Vidal had been in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, having arrived on November 18. He would tell Twyman that his primary role had been to build a directional vehicle bomb, which was parked just outside Dealey Plaza. Had the snipers missed, the bomb was to be detonated as the presidential limo passed. When asked how he and Vidal were moved out of Dallas after the assassination, Hargraves revealed that they had been flown back to Miami via private plane on the afternoon of the 22nd. Reading once again from the transcript here. Question: you were the only 2 guys on the airplane? Answer: no, there were 2 other people, but both of them are living. Question: and yourself? Answer: yes. Question: and Philippe? Answer: yes. And a pilot. Vidal recovered from his bomb blast injuries there, and he resumed his ops into Cuba. And in March of 1964, was captured by Castro's forces attempting to infiltrate Cuba once again at or around Las Villas province. On May 29th, guys, of 1964, the Tampa Tribune reported that Vidal and his 3 surviving crew members had been executed by firing squad. I tossed around the word rogue a lot at the beginning of this thing. Heck, it's even in the title. But Vidal was exactly that. He was rogue. He resented the U.S. government, and he was enraged at the notices of prevention of departure. He hated the Kennedys, and he had a deeply ingrained distrust of the Central Intelligence Agency. Remember back in the Tony Suesta segment, we talked about the Suesta-led attack on that Russian ship, the Baku. One of the attacks that pushed the Kennedys into implementing RFK's shutdown to begin with. Vidal was actually convinced that the whole thing was a setup, that Alpha 66 had pulled a false flag attack initiated by CIA specifically to help give the Kennedys a pretext to shut him and others like him, like Pedro Diaz-Lanz, completely down. He even told the FBI as much. Remember earlier, we tagged along with the FBI as they asked around about Vidal in January of 64. Well, they did finally run up on him. Check this out. From the same previously cited FBI document dated January 20 of 1964, reflecting a follow-up interview with Vidal. Quote, Vidal said he wants to leave the United States but cannot go to South America and begin operations there because lack of money. He has to stay in the U.S. but cannot continue his work for the liberation of Cuba in the United States because of U.S. government interference. Vidal complained that every time the Cuban Exile Group plans some military action against Cuba, one of the groups sells the information to the U.S. government. The mission is stopped, boats and arms confiscated. Vidal maintained that the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for the raid conducted by Commandos L in March of 1963. In this raid, Commandos L sank the Russian ship Baku off the northern coast of Cuba. Vidal said that the CIA then used this raid as an excuse to stop all further attacks against Cuba by anti-communist Cubans in the United States, accusing the Kennedys and the CIA, again, of pulling a false flag, of creating a pretext specifically to facilitate the shutting down of operations, of betraying the cause, of working together in opposition to his cause. Imagine the anger. Imagine the resentment. Again, I'll ask the question. Would Vidal and Diaz-Lanz, along with the other paramilitary operators shut down by the Kennedys in 1963, would they be the perfect sort of rogue operators that, say, a rogue paramilitary operative or agent handler or two, be they CIA or military intelligence or otherwise, might consider for recruitment for this? The blackest of black operations, the paramilitary style murder by sniper of a sitting U.S. president. Already possessing the skill, the tradecraft for this sort of operation. Already motivated. Already furious. Long past desperate. Already having come to the conclusion that the biggest obstacle between themselves and their return to a free Cuba was the president. Would they be most likely to avail themselves of an opportunity, an offered opportunity to solve their extraordinary problem themselves, with support, with cover? I think the answer is an unequivocal yes. This presentation was written by me, Doug Campbell, of the Dallas Action Podcast, presented by Wall Street Window, recorded and engineered by Corrado Scaranucci Jr. for Drop D Podcast Productions and the Assassination Archives and Research Center. We sincerely thank you for your time.